The Dolphins, the Brisbane club who are too afraid to say they're from Brisbane because it might make people like them less. The 2023 NRL season was filled with feel-good stories, but right up among the best of them was the Dolphins defying expectations to start the season strongly, after many tipped them to struggle to win a game in their inaugural season. A tough injury run really tested their depth, and they just ran out of puff by the end of the season. But a fantastic signing spree and more experience into the likes of Isaiah Katoa and Hamiso Tabuai-Fidow should see them be stronger in 2024. In what is very likely to be Wayne Bennett's final season with the club, there'll be a lot of focus on how they build towards life under assistant coach Christian Wolf, and whether they can continue developing at the same trajectory as they did last season. As I mentioned, the Dolphins have had a fantastic signing spree, bringing in several high quality players. In terms of which one of them will have the most impact this season, it's very much a two-horse race for me between the two signings of Brisbane, Herbie Farnworth and Thomas Flegler, but I have gone for Farnworth. I just think that the Dolphins struggled slightly with their outside backs last season, particularly in the centre position. We saw Hamiso Tabuai-Fidow get moved there towards the end of the year, and of course he does play centre for the Maroons. So signing a centre of the quality of Herbie Farnworth just solves that problem. It means that they can focus on having the hammer at fullback, where he is probably best suited in clubland and where he is the most important for the Dolphins. Herbie is only 24 years old, and while he did stand out relatively at the Broncos last season, this move to the Dolphins will really give him an opportunity to be a figurehead of the club, a real star player. It'll be interesting to see how he responds to that pressure, but we saw him perform in last season's finals series, so he's no stranger to having to operate at the highest level under a significant amount of pressure. Of course, honourable mention to Thomas Flegler, who is an Origin calibre forward. He's going to have a tremendous impact at the Dolphins this season as well, pairing him with the likes of Jesse Bromwich, Tom Gilbert when he returns. It's an exciting forward pack for the Dolphins this year. Having a look through their transfer losses, I'd say the biggest one is Herman Sasa, and no disrespect to Herman, but I think that's a sign of the fact that the Dolphins have retained well. Sasa is a solid first grader. He played the vast majority of games for the Dolphins last year, but looking at the depth that they do have in the forwards, I think they'll be able to cover for that pretty well, and overall the squad that they have going into 2024 to me is much stronger on paper than the one they had going into 2023. But now on to the talking points for the Dolphins heading into this season, the first being how do they deal with the high expectations. Now, as I mentioned, coming to their inaugural season last year, nobody had any expectations for the Dolphins. People generally had them tipped to finish in last place, and there was a real concern that they'd struggled to recruit enough star power to compete in the NRL. But now that is different. Guys who they recruited like Hamiso Tabuai-Fidow, who was a bench player when he arrived at the club, is now an Origin superstar. A guy like Sean O'Sullivan, who was a reserve grade halfback, is now a very solid first grader. You even look at someone like Connolly Lemuelu, who they signed from the Cowboys, who was in and out of first grade up in North Queensland, but has now really cemented his spot at the Dolphins and is one of the more damaging back rowers that is in our competition. So the expectations on these same players are much, much higher, and it'll be interesting to see how they do respond to that. The Dolphins are a club with many strong, good leaders in the club. We mentioned Wayne Bennett, but also the likes of Jesse and Kenny Bromwich, Felice Kaufusi. These are players who have played at the top level for the majority of their careers. So they'll be used to expectation, and there'll be a lot of responsibility on their shoulders to guide some of these younger guys through the pressure that the media can bring on. Looking at the players the Dolphins have, I don't particularly see it being much of an issue, but it is a difference between this year and last year, and it will be interesting to see how they respond to that. Speaking of those veteran players though, the next point is, can the old guard get up again? I mentioned the Bromwich brothers, Felice Kaufusi. You've got guys like Jared Wallace and Mark Nichols as well. These are players coming to the end of their careers, and they're absolutely fantastic champions who played really well last year. But when you get to an age like that, every new season brings a new challenge. The Dolphins will be depending on those guys to get up again for this new season, but we'll only really see whether they're up to that once the season starts. Fortunately, the Dolphins' recruitment does mean that if some of those guys aren't quite the players they used to be, they can bring in players to replace them. Fortunately, the Dolphins' recruitment drive means that if some of those veterans aren't quite the players they used to be, they can bring in younger guys to fill that gap. I mentioned guys like Conley Lemuelu coming into the back row, or a guy like Thomas Flegler taking the load off of Jesse Bromwich. It is a really good sign from the Dolphins that they are recruiting for the future in that way, and building towards a really solid foundation and structure long term. As I mentioned, Wayne Bennett is moving on at the end of this season, so to see the future of the club, at least on field, relatively secured is really encouraging. And that ties in well to my third talking point, which is how do they set up for life after Bennett? Now, these young recruits do show that the Dolphins are looking to build a solid foundation long term for the club. They do know that this will be Wayne Bennett's last season with the club, so they're looking to sort of lock up the long-term future, at least on field. And that's exactly what they've done. It's a really encouraging sign to see guys like Jake Averillo, Herbie Farnworth, Thomas Flegler brought in, guys who probably still have the best of their careers in front of them. And the same would be said for guys like Isaiah Katoa, Hamiso Tabuai-Fidow, Tessie New, etc. Even before the Dolphins arrived in the NRL, they had one of the strongest junior bases in the competition. It's one of the factors that made them so attractive when they were selected to be the NRL 17th team. So while we do generally see teams struggle once Wayne Bennett leaves the club, all signs point towards this being an exception to that rule. He's leaving a very young, very talented side under a very good assistant coach, a guy, Christian Wolf, who has had success both at the international level and in the Super League before. Now, this is the best 17 I've got for the Dolphins this season. They're one of the more difficult teams to do just because they've got so much depth and so many players that are sort of a similar quality, and you just can't fit them all into a 17. As usual, I've got a few players highlighted, the first being Tessie New on the wing. Now, we have seen a lot of rumours that Jack Bostock will get that role, and I don't have a huge problem with that at all. He's played a bit of first grade and has looked completely at home. But I'm still a believer in Tessie New's potential. People sort of have a bit of a misconception about him because he has been around for a few seasons, but he is still a very, very young player. So I do believe that he's got a higher ceiling probably than Bostock, and so I just wanted to find him a spot in this roster. He's probably better suited to fullback or centre, but we've seen his form in the first round of trials against the Capras. He was very, very good, albeit at centre. I just think he deserves a spot in the 17 somewhere. Then at 6 we've got Isaiah Katoa. I've seen a lot of people have Cody Nikorima in that role, and I will admit, if the Dolphins are looking for success this season, Cody Nikorima is probably the way to go. I think he's a slightly better player than Katoa at the moment, but Katoa is one of the most talented young halves in the competition, and his ceiling, I believe, is significantly higher than Cody's. So in terms of what is best for the club long term, I would absolutely be going with Katoa. I do think we've seen enough from him to say that he is solid in first grade and will do a job, and really every game he will be improving. Just the more experience this young guy gets, they'll only be better for it in the long run. Then lastly, in jersey 17, we've got the great Jared Wallace. Now, the only reason I've got him highlighted is that it's very much a two-horse race for that final spot on my bench between him and Mark Nichols. And it's what I said earlier, a lot of depth and a lot of guys that are just of a very similar quality. Now, we will see injuries. This is a perfect, ideal best 17, so I'm sure Mark Nichols and Jared Wallace will both be getting a lot of first grade this season. But for me, Jared slightly pips him in their best 17 just because I think his form was slightly better last season. If you're looking at recent years, perhaps Mark Nichols has been a little more consistent over that time. But since arriving at the Dolphins, I think Wallace has been extremely impressive and to me deserves that spot there. All that being said, when I did sit down to do my ladder predictions and considered all the other clubs, I do still have the Dolphins pretty much in the same position as they finished last year. I'm very comfortable having them in 13th. I believe they will be in the top half of that sort of bottom 9. So bottom 9 is still so weird to say. I do think they'll be a better team this season. They're definitely more star-studded than they were last year. But with the relative strength of other teams and their greater travel load this season, I don't necessarily see the Dolphins going forward by that much. That being said, they are a side who absolutely have the potential to make finals and put egg on my face at the end of the year, and I will be completely owning up to it if I'm wrong about it. So as usual, let me know your thoughts for the Dolphins in season 2024. Do you think they can deal with the new high expectations? How will they build towards life under Wayne Bennett? And would you make any changes to my 17? Thanks for watching, I'll see you later.